So, yes, Africa has been in the news a little bit today. I don't know how many of you heard about the Nairobi attacks with Al-Shabaab, but there was a mall that I believe was under attack for something like 3 or 4 days. It just finished up today, and Al-Shabaab actually has kind of come in and out of the media, especially here in Minnesota, what with a few Somali kids having traveled over to Somalia, and there was a whole FBI investigation a few years ago about jihadists coming from Minnesota to Somalia to fight with Al-Shabaab. And there's some interesting history there with the U.S. relationship. I'm really not going to get into that much, except to highlight the fact that the U.S. government-to-government relationships with Africa have been overwhelmingly in relationship to the war on terror and to dealing with piracy in the Gulf of Aden, or dealing with the terrorism, Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb, the insurgency in Mali, the actions in Libya and in Egypt, and in Somalia, Kenya. The U.S. supported the Ethiopian invasion of Somalia a few years ago that was backed by the African Union. So, that's the rubric. This national and international security is really the rubric that the U.S. government predominantly works through. And then there are multinational institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and there's some smaller level ones that a lot of U.S. corporations and government entities will work with in relationship with various African nations. China operates very, very differently from that. We'll find that there's often parallels to what the U.S. does, but they really take on a completely different flavor than what we see from the West. And so I'm going to pull things back a little bit. First of all, a lot of people talk about Africa ignorantly as if it's a country. It's not, but it's actually worth treating it as a holistic unity in this context, because when you talk about Africa as a continent and China as a country, you're actually talking about some fairly equal things. China's population right now is about 1.3 billion. Africa's is 1.1. Their GDP is not equal now, but it was recently. As only in the last 10, 15 years has China really shot past Africa as a whole. And obviously within Africa there's all kinds of variants, but treating Africa as a unity isn't actually as crazy as it seems when relating it to China. Just for some comparison, this is China and Africa, this is China and the U.S. relative. So the U.S. has always been significantly stronger. This is a log scale, but you'll see that China is the second largest economy of the world now, and it's kind of edging up on that trend line. So it's not entirely insane to treat that. And when you look at China's rhetoric, it begins to make a little sense too. There was a 2006 white paper where China outlined its policy with regards to Africa. And in the very first sentence of the second paragraph, it describes itself. It says, China, the largest developing nation in the world. And that's really China's self-identity. Yeah, they have the most billionaires of any country in the world. They also have 500 million people living on less than $2 a day. So it definitely has this self-perception that we are still developing. And when you look at how recently many of these changes have happened, that's a fairly legitimate assessment. The one thing that really divides them, though, is China is over 91% ethnically Han. There are Chinese dialects, but overwhelmingly they speak the same language. They have the same political governance structure. Many of the other economic and political entities are all linked throughout the nation, and so you get diversity, but it's a pretty whole, united whole overall. When you contrast that with Africa, where you have 54 nations, you have 3,000 ethnic groups and over 2,000 languages, you have nothing close to the kind of integration that is possible from a human-to-human perspective. And that's really where the title of this talk came from, because as we'll see at the end, Africans themselves realize that the only way that they're going to survive in any real sense is by having all Pan-African groups at a political and an economic level capable of engaging with both the West and with China and India in a strong enough way that they can actually treat each other as equals. As it stands right now, they're nowhere close to that capacity, and it's because Africa is deeply riven by internal conflicts. You'll see a book in the back there, Africa's World War, about the conflict in the DRC. But then all the different sections of the African economy and political landscape as well. So we'll go through that. So the quote is also referencing the quote attributed to Benjamin Franklin in the early American Revolution, saying, we must all hang together, or we shall all hang separately. And while the Chinese relationship with Africa isn't quite as predatory as the British was of the American colonies, it definitely has aspects of that. So I'm going to jump into some history here. One of the interesting things that came up in my research was that aside from the voyages of Zheng He in the 1400s, there's basically zero contact directly between China and Africa until 1950. It was all mediated through Arab trade, European trade, but you really had no direct contact. Although it was interesting how far Zheng He did come. His voyages came all the way up through the Horn of Africa, up into Egypt, down almost to Tanzania. But yeah, after that, they really stopped. The Chinese Navy was basically decommissioned under the next emperor and never really came back. And really, you have a kind of a parallel histories between China and Africa, and I'll read a quote here shortly that touches on that from Kwesi Kwa Pra, who's an African thinker. And he says that there's a hiatus, an enormous hiatus, because of the distance and difficulty of communications and the colonial interlude which both China and Africa encountered. China went through a cycle which is not too different from the African cycle in terms of its encounters with the West and colonialism. From the period of the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion, the period of about a half century which ended in 1902, 1903. Then there was the period before China became a republic in 1912, and the era of the warlords, post-1912 to the beginnings of the Chinese Revolution in the early 1920s. And then from on in the early 1920s to 1948, when China, in the words of Mao Zedong, stood up in 1949. China actually calls that period the century of humiliation. You had 2 opium wars with the British. You had really 2 wars with the Japanese, border conflicts with the USSR, and a deeply divided country with a civil war that only really resolved in 1949 with the pushing of the Republic of China off into Taiwan. This was the 1911 flag, and I thought this was kind of intriguing. I'd never actually seen this flag before, but right in the early Republican days, they were cognizant of the different groups that they were trying to unite under this banner of the Republic of China. On the African side, and this is just to break down some of the provinces, the thing with China as well is the ethnic divisions are largely geographically displaced. So you basically don't see the Uyghur people outside of the Xinjiang province. On the Africa side, you have massive impacts from colonialism. China was never formally colonized, but it was definitely under the sway of the British for many years. Africa was fully colonized, and you'll have 1898 here. The pink here is British, the blue is French. 1920, the British have kind of linked up their territories here. 1936, you have some of the fallout of the 20s. And then post-World War II, Egypt is nominally independent, although really the British control it. French still have their properties. Belgium now has the territory that used to be under German control. So in the 50s, we really get the beginnings of the Republic of China is now in Taiwan, but they have the UN seat. They're on the Security Council. They're the one that the rest of the world recognizes diplomatically. And this is a huge, huge sore spot for the People's Republic of China. And it's a combination of things. It's a combination of feeling inadequate relative to the USSR, of trying to come out of their century of humiliation, and trying to deal with the huge conflicts that they've had with the Republic of China. So the one China policy that was still today is dominant in Chinese thought. You cannot diplomatically recognize Taiwan and maintain political relations with mainland China today. It's still a very, very sensitive spot. On the African side, in the 1950s, only Ethiopia, Liberia, white-ruled South Africa were independent, and Egypt was nominally independent. They had a king, but they also had 10,000 British troops at the Suez, so not quite as independent. Egypt was the first to recognize China, and it was right after the officers' revolt that brought in the United Arab Republic. And this is a breakdown of, I don't have a legend here, but basically brown is the 50s, blue is the 60s, and pink, I believe, is the 70s. So you'll see here, South Africa, Egypt, and then blue. I mean, the 1960s were seismic in Africa. Basically, the entire continent achieved independence in the 1960s. And China, the PRC in particular, when I use China without qualification, it's going to mean the PRC, basically saw this as their opportunity. We can get votes in the UN if enough of these newly independent nations recognize us. And so there was a huge diplomatic push for every country in Africa, no matter how small, to recognize China as soon as they gained independence. And there was a push, as much as they could, given the fact that China was still a poor agrarian state with all of the domestic contradictions it had, but they pushed as hard as they could to see revolutionary movements, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial movements gain traction within Africa. Most of that support was really ideological, because they couldn't afford to provide military or economic aid, but to the extent that they could, they did. And there was a sympathy there, because China had never been involved in the slave trade. China had never been involved in colonialism. China had basically never had a direct relationship with Africa, and so they were coming into a situation where all the existing players had these burdened histories, and they were able to step in and say, look, we're poor, we're agrarian, we fought off the imperialists, you can too, let's find some support here. And overwhelmingly, countries that gained independence did recognize the PRC, and in 1971, that paid off. China was dealing with massive amount of internal contradictions, though, too. So in the late 50s, early 60s, you had the Great Leap Forward, and really the Great Chinese Famine. Yang Zhisheng put out a book called Tombstone a few years ago, and it just came out in English last year. And a Communist Party official, basically determined the death toll of the Great Leap Forward was 40 million people. And from a demographics perspective, there's another 40 million people that basically never existed, that demographically you would have expected them to have existed, but because of the deaths and food insecurity and whatnot, people just didn't procreate. So you had an 80 million person gap between expected population and actual population in the mid-60s. And the fact that China was still growing at nearly 10% per decade, 10% per year, in the midst of all this, when people talk about Chinese resilience, there's something to that. Also in that period, you had the Tibetan uprising in the late 50s, which led to the fact that the Dalai Lama went into India, and the fact that the India-China border was really not clearly articulated. You had this tension where Nehru on the India side and Zhou Enlai on the Chinese side basically said, we're fine with the border exactly as it is. But the borders that they each meant were quite different, and they ended up having some border wars. The USSR sided with India on this, and this led to increased tensions with the Soviet Union, especially because the Soviet Union had also had some border tensions with China on the Mongolian side. So after that border war with India, Zhou Enlai put forward the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which Here's a list of the nations in Africa by order of when they recognized the PRC. Swaziland's the only one that's never recognized. There's 3 others that have since reneged and gone back to recognizing the Republic of China.
So Mauritius is on there?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Here we go. So this was in the mid-50s here, and his 5 principles: mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, non-interference, equality, mutual benefit, peaceful coexistence. You'll find there's some coded speak in most Chinese documents, especially from the party. And mutual non-aggression, mutual respect, non-interference. Non-interference is huge, and you'll still see that today, where a lot of the criticism of Chinese foreign policy is really, in a sense, a misunderstanding of what China sees its core diplomatic mission as. It doesn't see its mission as fixing other countries, and a lot of that is because it doesn't want to be fixed by other countries. It's very, very sensitive about that, and so it will tolerate behavior that it despises, frankly, if it means that it can then say, well, we don't do that to you, you have no claim to do that to us. So then in the 70s and the 80s, 1971 was the UN General Resolution to recognize the PRC. The Republic of China lost its seat on the Security Council. This was the payoff for the last 2 decades of diplomatic and military and party-to-party cadre interactions with African nations, and the whole seismic groundswell of African nations achieving independence. The next year, Nixon visited, and part of that was really coming out of, from the Chinese side at least, the pressures with the Soviet Union. They were dealing with the border conflicts in the Northwest, and reaching out to Nixon was on Zedong's side kind of a way to say, well, we have other possibilities besides the Soviet Union as well. So I know in the US there was a lot of interesting internal discussion about that visit, but not a lot of people hear about the Chinese political sides of that. You had the Cultural Revolution, late 60s into the 70s. Really the worst of it was over by the early 70s, but you still had kind of trailing off. They polled all diplomatic personnel from Africa, with the exception of, I think, the ambassador to Egypt, for re-education. And it basically set back their international agenda by about a decade. But you had a huge, huge focus internally, not just from the Cultural Revolution perspective. China, and this statistic just blows my mind, China's imports of machinery in the years 1973 to 1975, in 1973, they imported $860 million worth of machinery, which was 1/5 of their total imports. The next year, that raised to $1.6 billion, which was 1/4 of their total imports. And by 1975, they were at $2.2 billion worth of machinery for 1/3 of their imports. They industrialized in about 5 years. Just huge, huge, huge expenditures on this. So while they were dealing with some of these diplomatic conflicts, also a lot of their engagements in Africa were playing the other side to the Soviet Union, and we'll get into some of the specifics of that. But you had a number of almost proxy wars between China and the Soviet Union in various African nations, Angola being the preeminent example. In the 80s, you were beginning to see the fruits of this constant growth, but part of the problem is, 10% growth per year is impressive. When you're starting from an incredibly small number, 10% of an incredibly small number is still an incredibly small number. So it wasn't immediately apparent that there was really anything happening here, but by the time you hit the 80s, and especially when you got the economic reforms that came with Deng Xiaoping, you started to actually see some traction. And I missed some of my slide cues here, but here's the New York Times at the UN recognition here. The Nixon visit. And then this is a quote I found from He Wenping, which really captures the principles of Chinese diplomacy in the 80s, switching from ideological idealism, their support in the 60s of various revolutionary groups just because they were revolutionary groups, to pragmatic idealism, and from unconditional internationalism to a priority of national interest. And a lot of that came from, frankly, China was naive in its engagements with a lot of African revolutionary groups. They saw them as being internationalist, communist comrades. Many of them were just fights for national liberation. They really didn't have any objectives beyond their immediate locales. And when that finally sunk in, China adjusted accordingly. And just to give a picture, the growth of the Chinese GDP from 1970 to 1980 went from 91 billion to 189 billion. So that was a 207% growth over that decade. So then getting into the 1990s and 2000s here, I'm going to focus a little bit on the Chinese Party, the Communist Party of China. This is the most distinct aspect, really, of engaging with China. China does have a government, believe it or not. Its government is really secondary to the party. But China has government. It has government officers. It has an army, the People's Liberation Army. It has public and private companies. But behind all of those is the Communist Party of China. And what that allows for is a level of collaboration and interaction that really is unparalleled. And that comes in very heavily with how China interacts with Africa, because it acts in a coordinated fashion where you have aid and government recognition and party-to-party relationships and sister city relationships and private company investment, and everything kind of comes in, and you often will have these different entities actually coordinating off of each other. So a public company may take a contract at very, very low profit, possibly even slightly below profit, because it achieves a diplomatic end. This is one of the major difficulties with particularly in the economic sphere, because most US and Western companies are really operating more or less autonomously. They don't have much coordination. Maybe there's a little bit of coordination through the World Bank, some coordination through the US government or through the French government. But generally speaking, you don't have anything like that level of coordination across these different dimensions. And this is particularly striking at the party-to-party level. And just to give one example, South Sudan. China has a policy of recognizing and maintaining the status quo regardless of what that is. And so if you're in power, they will have relations with you. If you get kicked out of power and another entity comes into power, they will gladly recognize the new entity. And they really have no qualms about that, but they're not going to support overthrowing you. That has to happen independently of their relationship. But they can see where the wind's blowing. And in the case of South Sudan, it was pretty clear which way the wind was blowing several years before it actually blew. And so you had a situation where the People's Republic of China at a government level recognized Sudan under Omar al-Bashir. But the Communist Party of China had party-to-party relationships and cadre meetings with South Sudanese separatists for years before the actual separation. And when the formal separation occurred, they already had these deep relationships, and the PRC just said, right, we recognize you. Let's continue, kind of where we left off. So it's a really interesting interplay where China can say, we formally do not recognize diplomatically these separatist rebels, but still hedge their bets in those situations. There's also been a huge push for brand management. Xinhua, the Chinese national news agency, has more offices in Africa than any other news agency. And it's really, in many countries, it is the only international news agency present in many African countries. Medical personnel, one of the, I don't know the exact numbers relative to Western medical personnel, but China sends a ridiculous number of doctors and other medical personnel to African nations. And really, from a lay African person's perspective, they see the infrastructure projects and they see the medical personnel, and that's really the average African's interaction with China. And then there's Confucius centers all throughout the continent, usually tied to universities, and these are cultural engagement centers. They will often teach Chinese, and they'll often coordinate university, I forget what they call them, transfer programs, where students will study in China and vice versa. And kind of centered in this decade, you had Hu Jintao, really echoing Zhou Enlai a few decades before, with the 4 no's in 1997. He said no hegemonism, no power politics, no military alliances, no arms races. And some of those are a little fuzzy, like the no military alliances. Well, technically, China supports the military of every country in Africa to some degree. I think more what they're getting at is no super strategic military alliances, no military bases is really the big one. Hegemonism. Hegemony is this idea of a coordinated central power, and so and it's a unilateral power over many other entities. And so the idea that he's trying to push there is that we are not trying to unilaterally impose our will on you. We want this to be more of a...
Is China not tied with IMF then?
China has a relationship with those. There's actually been some movement lately to form I don't know if you've heard of the term BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, kind of the second level emerging economies. There's been talk between these nations of starting a southern developing countries alternative to these institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. At present, the way it works is China does have some vote. In fact, it actually got its voting rights increased recently in both institutions. But really, China tends to coordinate bilateral loan agreements, concessionary loans, things like that, where it'll be below World Bank interest rates, and it'll often be paid in either paid in infrastructure or paid off in minerals or oil. So it's a slightly different relationship usually. And then just to kind of touch on the growth, I talked about the 1970s. 1980 to 1990, the Chinese GDP grew 188%. 1990 to 2000, it grew 335%. And from 2000 to 2010, it grew 494%. So you're really talking this hockey stick economic growth. And a lot of this ends up being, they're actually stepping on the toes of some other parties that are trying to invest in Africa. So recently, China just beat out by a ridiculous margin a bid by India on some oil rights in, I believe, Angola. India was offering to build some roads. There's going to be about 40 million invested, and China just offered 10 times that basically and said we're taking it. Similarly, they were barred from working in a particular field also off the coast of Angola, and so what happened was they bought a controlling share in the relevant company through Sinopec and got in that way. so you end up with a number of different strategies. So there's within Africa and tied to the African Union. The African Union, unlike the European Union, was initially political and is secondarily economic, whereas the European Union was initially economic and only secondarily political. And I have what it stands for somewhere, but I don't remember off the top of my head. NEPAD, NEPAD, is the economic arm of the African Union. It's completely dysfunctional. It's really not done anything of note. And so that would ideally be the body through which African nations would get together and actually obtain good terms with China. As it stands, the most functional body is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which not surprisingly enough, is really run by China. And this is really where, at this point, nearly every nation in Africa is a member of this body. They meet every 3 years, so they met in 2000, 2003, 2006, 2012, 2009, 2012. And 2006 was when China actually released their formal white paper on their policy in Africa. And that was really to bring these first 6 years in. In 2012, they pledged something like $20 billion worth of investment in Africa in the next 3 years. So there's a huge amount of investment. China also forgave something like $2.5 billion worth of debt to the countries with the worst economies. They've given a number of concessionary loans. And then you also have situations where they've given tariff-free status to exports from the poorest performing countries in Africa.
How does the 20 billion compare to the rest of the world's economies? Say with what American involvements or European
It's still
involvements?
less. In aggregate from the West is still the dominant entity in terms of aid and investment and what have you. But China is larger than any single Western actor, probably any two.
Real quick, India,
Yeah.
just kind of pushed to the side at this point, or are they still trying?
India's fighting pretty hard, and Brazil
Their
and
influence?
Russia are all getting inroads wherever they can. And they are getting inroads. It's just they're not getting everything they want.
What is the deal with the French liking parts of South Africa and not liking India?
The French are really interesting because the more you watch French politics, it feels like they've never really gotten over the colonies. I was shocked to find out Mitterrand supported the Hutus and actually gave them arms and trained them militarily, leading up to the whole Rwanda massacre. And you had the engagements in Libya and Mali in the last few years here, and some of the economic engagements. So I don't really understand exactly everything that's going on there, but France clearly hasn't quite let go of Africa.
The reason I ask is it's from a technology standpoint. I don't understand all the politics, but I know the technology. And there are people in the UK, somehow tied indirectly with France, that do all of their offshore development in Mauritius.
Oh, interesting.
And they like Mauritius because they're French speaking. And they don't like to do their development in India because they don't speak French. So there's a tie there from the French to Mauritius. And it's very odd. So for example, I'll go to Mauritius this January for a couple of
Mhm.
weeks. And I'll spend a couple weeks over there and probably take my wife over there. But it's interesting too because our UK teams will go down to Mauritius and have them do the work. And if you go to Mauritius is a small island just off of Madagascar. And in Mauritius, there's my company, Ceridian, and there's also Accenture.
Okay.
So it's just really odd that as big of, the world is, that of those two different companies that are on that island, both of them I've worked for
Yeah.
in the past. And the Mauritius culture is very different, and they're very innovative,
Hmm.
and they're very high-tech based, where not all areas, but with India, it's more very hierarchical chain of command like.
Yeah.
So it's
Well, the education system too kind of reinforces that a fair amount. And I mean, India does have ITT, but generally speaking, a lot of the schools produce people who can do rote work, but not as much the really innovative.
So there's this whole high-tech kind of area, it seems like, in Africa that's starting to grow and develop and be more competitive than India.
Yeah, and you get some really interesting. There's a blog called AfriGadget that is fantastic, and it's focused a little bit more on Central Africa, but some of the stuff is just brilliant. And you're really dealing with, in a sense, Africa's leapfrogging. The U.S. had huge amounts of investments in infrastructure, power lines, energy systems, and roads, and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of African nations, frankly, never really got the infrastructure. And so now that we're talking solar power and wireless stuff and cell phones, and a lot of mobile money has been a thing in Africa for years. It still is sci-fi over here. I mean, really, it's not a normative part of life for people here of, I'll just pay it with my cell phone credits. That's got a big thing here. Like, what is this thing I wave my cell phone at Starbucks? A lot of places in Africa have been doing that for, almost a decade now. They've actually institutionalized it.
Is that like the Bitcoin thing or similar to that?
Bitcoin's a little different. In this case, basically, you're treating cell phone time as a currency. So
That's the commodity.
yeah, so it's basically I'm paying whatever real currency for X amount of minutes, and then we swap those minutes around and then convert them back.
Is that more of a barter situation, or like, do businesses accept that as a currency as well?
Businesses accept it, yeah. Yeah, but it's definitely aimed at the small business person,
Right.
and that's really who utilizes it. So even farmers and mechanics and people like that. But this is not going all the way back, but long tail earlier to here. The interesting thing is, in aggregate between Africa and China, the trade balance is basically held. The problem is really when you talk about country to country, you have huge swings, with some countries having a huge trade imbalance in their favor, like Equatorial Guinea, and then other countries where it's a huge trade imbalance in China's favor. But in aggregate, it's grown kind of apace.
And I was wondering, actually, I run a few questions. I think
Yeah.
is most of the African to China trade mostly raw materials, minerals and oil.
I've actually got a slide a little later on that'll actually break it down for you. And then this is a meeting of Jacob Zuma and Hu Jintao at one of the forum meetings. And the primary goal for China right now is, by the late 1980s, they'd really crossed that threshold where they could support domestic industry with domestic materials and energy, and they needed to import. And so Africa's primary role in China is that of minerals and energy, and secondarily that of an export market. Both of those require secure channels for transportation, and so a lot of Chinese actions in the South China Sea, in the West Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Aden, are all related to how do we secure our transport lines? How do we make sure? So China's actually had a ship in the Gulf of Aden supporting the anti-piracy actions with the U.S. for about a year and a half now. And this is the first real major naval thing that they've done. They've also built relationships with Mauritius and Seychelles and Madagascar, and who's that? I think Robert Kaplan at the Atlantic called it the string of pearls strategy. It's this idea of we want friendly ports all through the Indian Ocean because we need that. that's really.
And the big challenge, it used to be the Somali pirates would steal ships or
Mhm.
capture them or whatever. My biggest challenge now is Somali pirates found a more lucrative thing, and what they do is they drag anchors and they try and dig up your internet lines. They don't pay the ransom, they pull a big internet cord. So I've had actually Somali pirates cut my internet line to my developers because I didn't pay my
That's interesting.
blackmail money. So it's much cheaper to just drag the internet line, hold it with your anchor going, hey, chainsaw it if you don't pay. Oop, you're down.
Wow, I'd not heard of that.
Which was really interesting to explain to my boss why the internet went down, and I said, it's Somalia pirates, can't make that one up.
Wow.
Wow. I have a few countries that I'm gonna highlight. I'm gonna skip a couple of them here. There we go. Sudan's kind of a hot button one. As you can see, it hasn't exactly had the most stable political existence. I think I skipped a few coups in there.
That's the highlights.
Those are the highlights. But basically, when people talk about China and Sudan, really they're talking about after Omar al-Bashir in 1989. And the fact of it is, slightly earlier than that, Chevron actually left because citing security concerns, and you kind of had this vacuum. Sudan's very resource rich, very oil rich, and it has basically nobody willing to trade with it. China is willing to trade, and China is willing to trade as long as the Sudanese don't get touchy about how China treats the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, and China won't complain about the Janjaweed and the South Sudanese, and there's kind of this tension, and so there's very much been, and this existed actually even, their relationship goes back before Bashir, and you had some really surreal situations like in the early 70s when the USSR supported the Sudanese Communist Party in a coup attempt, and China backed the conservative regime, and they just crushed the Sudanese communists, which really illustrates that idea of we will support the status quo and regardless. So that makes a little bit more sense than when we start talking about the tragedy that happened in Darfur, or the small arms that were funneled from Sudan to rebels in Chad, that caused kind of a political to-do. And on top of it, China's been Bashir's friend in the UN. The International Criminal Court tried to incite charges against him twice, and China basically blocked that both times. And because Western nations won't engage with Sudan, China has an effective monopoly on all those resources. And so it's been a very lucrative trading partner for China. And I already mentioned their strategy with regards to South Sudan. Burkina Faso is intriguing in that it's one of the only countries that it recognized the Republic of China initially. In the 70s, it had a massive famine, and Zhou Enlai sent vaccines and food and aid, and they recognized the PRC. But then in 1993, they actually swapped back, and they are one of 4 countries that recognize the ROC in Africa today. But they still do a huge amount of trade with the People's Republic of China. So they don't mind economic activity with both. It's the political recognition that's really the toggle. Ghana was really intriguing because it achieved independence fairly early on in the late 50s, and Kwame Nkrumah recognized Beijing right away in 1960. In fact, there's Nkrumah and Zedong, and they actually had a really good relationship for the most part, except for the Angola situation, which I'll get to. But Ghana was also a hub for guerrillas who ended up going to Cote d'Ivoire and Benin, Niger, Cameroon, the Congo. Interestingly, none of those guerrillas were actually fighting colonial powers. All of those countries at the time were actually independent, and they were fighting conservative governments or dictatorships instead. And in 1966, while Nkrumah was actually visiting Beijing, he was deposed, and all of Chinese embassy personnel were kicked out of the country. And it took a few years before they reestablished relations, really because of the economics of it. And things have been kind of warming up since. So in 2003, Hu Jintao visited, and they've instantiated some agreements since then. I'm going to skip Nigeria here. There we go. Except for this, Nigeria is also very oil rich, and some people have said that the Nigerian government is a puppet where Shell Oil Company is the hand. Shell's got people basically in every branch of Nigerian government. And so MEND is one of several resistance movements in Nigeria fighting what they see as foreigners exploiting their resources. But they don't care who the foreigners are. If you're Chinese, you're a problem as well, and they've actually kidnapped Chinese nationals and held them precisely for this reason. And so this was one of the missives that came from MEND with regards to Chinese investment. This came out right after China signed an agreement with Nigeria. Equatorial Guinea is there. And this is also indicative of China. They established relationships really early on with independence, even though this country was completely impoverished, massively corrupt, terrible human rights record, zero to offer. It paid off because of the UN vote, And it paid off again because they discovered a massive amount of oil. And so Equatorial Guinea is one of the few countries that runs a pretty heavy trade imbalance in their favor over China because they really don't import that much, and they export a ridiculous amount of oil. Tanzania is intriguing. They've had a long-standing healthy relationship with China, and one of the major positive PR things that happened was the Tanzam Railway. Zambia is landlocked, but it has huge copper mines, and there really wasn't the infrastructure to move the copper out of Zambia. And so Tanzania and Zambia went to the World Bank to get funding for it, and the World Bank basically refused. They said this isn't a viable project. No. China was willing to make it viable, and the project has definitely had its difficulties, and even today it's pretty massive cost overruns to deliver far less than was promised. But even still, it works, and it's been a huge public relations success despite the cost overruns and despite the reduced production, because it did link Zambia with Dar es Salaam and the ports there. Julius Nyerere did a number of other domestic projects with China early on. There was tensions with the Angola situation, which I'll touch on next. And they've really had a strong relationship with China, but it's pretty formal. It's not a lot of person-to-person contact. It's more institution to institution. Angola is the really interesting one because initially you had these three different militia groups, the FNLA, the UNITA, and the MPLA, who were all fighting the Portuguese. And China supported all three. But when the Portuguese were overthrown, the Russians supported the MPLA. And so kind of as, if the Russians are supporting them, that can't be right, so we're going to support the other two, with the strange bedfellows of the United States and white South Africa, which went over really well with China's allies, like Nigeria and Tanzania, who were supporting the MPLA with Russia. So you had a really, really strange civil war following the overthrow of the Portuguese in Angola. And eventually that settled out. It really has been kind of a punctuated equilibrium there. But by the late 80s, they had some economic agreements signed, and then massive amounts of oil exploration. Angola has also been really tense situation with regards to labor, because when China signed their agreements, stipulated in the agreements was that Chinese companies would do the work, and Chinese companies would bring in labor. Not 100%, theoretically, but over 70% in many cases. So Angola has a huge unemployment issue, but 70% or more of the labor happening on Angolan projects is done by imported Chinese labor. And this is a recurring problem. That's kind of an extreme example, but the same thing happens routinely all throughout Africa. I'm going to skip most of South Africa, except to the extent that South Africa alone constitutes 20% of China's trade with Africa. I mean, South Africa is a huge, huge economy. And when they talked about BRICS, there's a reason why South Africa is in there with Brazil and India. And finally, Zimbabwe is kind of right up there with Sudan in that category of very close relationships politically that the rest of the world finds incredibly distasteful. It was originally South Rhodesia, and China supported both the ZAPU and the ZANU revolutionary forces. The ZANU under Robert Mugabe won, and Mugabe's still there. And China supported his maintaining power for years, even to the extent of sending radio jamming equipment prior to the last elections so that they could override the opponent's political messages. They've also been building a call monitoring center in Harare, which has gone over really well with the opposition parties there. And China's also helped out in the UN by opposing sanctions, because sanctions have been proposed against Zimbabwe repeatedly. So you definitely have some curious relationships there. And just to kind of show, now I don't want to mislead with this. This is about growth. So Europe had a fair amount of resource relationships with Africa already, that hasn't grown tremendously. So that's why that's significantly smaller. You're really talking about relative growth, but from a relative growth perspective, it has been ridiculous. Also, in terms of federal direct investment, foreign direct investment, the countries, basically the darker red it is, the more they receive from China. You can kind of see the hot spots. Whoops. And then here's the slides that Lee was interested in. So Africa exports to China predominantly mineral fuel, crude, some manufactured goods, some other stuff, some machinery, overwhelmingly minerals and fuel. And then Chinese exports, on the other hand, overwhelmingly machinery and manufactured goods. And then this is just kind of a breakdown of exports and imports. And I'll leave that up for a little bit here. So basically, in summary, China is looking for minerals. A third of their oil that they import comes from Africa, and greater than 80 or 90% of many minerals come from Africa. And it needs export markets. So secure the supply lines, maintain the status quo is really the order of the day. They want stability, therefore they'll support UN peacekeeping, therefore they'll support anti-piracy efforts, therefore they'll support greater and a stronger African Union. They actually gave the African Union its headquarters in Addis Ababa, $200 million. The Chinese just built it. Just said, we want you to have it. There you go. And therefore, they also have that one China policy. They're mute on human rights issues, and they're looking at alternatives to the World Bank. They really do not want Western interests capable of unilaterally defining their agenda. Africa's concerns. Oh, I've already gone through that. Africa's concerns is really the collapse of internal industries. The textiles industry in particular in many, many African countries is just completely tanked. And even when China gives them tariff-free status, they can't compete. So it sounds nice. We're going to give you tariff-free status to our markets. They still can't compete with Chinese goods. And so it's completely led to a collapse of many domestic industries. The goods that China exports are considered to be low quality, but you have a combination of they cost less, and Chinese merchants will generally only buy supplies from Chinese companies. So even if the merchant is present in Benin and there's a Benin manufacturer right next to them, they're importing their stuff from China. Additionally, you have substandard labor conditions and imported labor in many cases, Angola being a key example. But as Chinese labor gets more expensive in China, there's been huge amounts of union protests and the like. Africa is being looked at as a source for cheaper than Chinese labor, which isn't necessarily an ideal situation there. And then there's the trade imbalances. I mean, for many African countries, the trade imbalances are obscene. And those only look balanced when you compare that with the oil exporting countries. So really they have the resource curse. The problem is that the Chinese companies are trying to move up the value chain. And by definition, that really means pushing a lot of the lower end stuff out. And a lot of where they're pushing that is to Africa. And just a couple of statistics here. 3/4 of African exports come from Angola, South Africa, Sudan, Libya, and the Republic of Congo. So those are really the exporters China cares about the most. 3/4, yeah. And then 1/2 of Chinese exports to Africa end up in South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Liberia, and Algeria, which also tend to have the strongest economies. And then from America's side, America shares China's interests in Africa's resources, in their growing economies, in their export markets, in their both China and the U.S. are interested in having African nations grow and develop economically and stabilize politically. Although what they mean by stabilize is often different. The U.S. interests, again, are really aimed very much towards a security perspective politically. So we talked a little bit about the anti-terrorism earlier. And there's a much heavier reliance by the U.S. on military bases and ports. The U.S. has a number of them and has recently added some non-military military bases like the JSOC base in Somalia.
What's a non-military match?
The Joint Special Operations Command is kind of outside of the chain of command of the Department of Defense. Obama's been trying to reintegrate it, but it was basically answered to Rumsfeld under Bush. And so it was kind of like a military that was outside of the military. Yeah. Most of the assassinations that you hear about are JSOC, not DOD. And then the other striking thing is really the U.S. political parties have absolutely nothing comparable to the Communist Party of China's engagement with party-to-party relationships. China's really tried to engage at every level. So government to government, party to party, state to state, city to city, institution to institution. They're really looking at a multidimensional relationship. With the U.S., it's primarily government to government and sometimes business to government, business to business. But you really don't have anything else of that nature. And so, like the Republican Party, the Democrat Party here, they'll both sometimes send electoral monitors to foreign countries, but you don't really have any kind of an international engagement outside of that. The other thing is, in many cases, the U.S. is actually losing deals because it cannot coordinate as tightly as the Chinese can at a political and economic and business level. Angola being the most recent example. So yeah, really to conclude, the only way Africa can compete is really as a continent. And that's been the issue with its engagements with the West in the past. That's the issue with its engagements with China today. I want to close with a quote from Thabo Mbeki in South Africa. He was the president at the time. It says, "It's possible to build an unequal relationship, the kind of relationship that has developed between African countries as colonies. The African continent exports raw material and imports manufactured goods, condemning it to underdevelopment. Africa does not want to be simply undeveloped forever and simply giving its natural resources until they run out and then have people move on. Africa wants to take this opportunity to actually bootstrap itself. And it comes down to it being able to resolve its internal contradictions politically, being able to form bridges, being able to develop things like the African Union and NIPAD to build a coherent answer to foreign powers." And that's it.